By the late months of the First World War, Halifax, Nova Scotia had become one of the busiest and most strategically important ports in North America. Its deep harbor remained free of ice even during winter, making it a vital launching point for Allied convoys heading towards Europe. Everyday merchant ships, troop transports, supply vessels, and naval escorts passed through its channels in a controlled but crowded stream of wartime traffic. On the morning of December 6, 1917, that system was placed under enormous pressure. Vessels were rushing to meet schedules, and wartime secrecy often complicated normal safety rules. Ships carrying dangerous materials were discouraged from displaying the red warning flag that normally alerted others to keep clear, because commanders feared it would signal to German submarines lurking off the coast. That same morning, 2 ships approached the harbor's narrowest point, known locally as the Narrows. One was the Norwegian vessel SS Imo, riding high in the water because she carried no cargo. She was preparing to travel to New York to load relief supplies for civilians in Belgium and was already behind schedule. Pushing to make up time, she traveled faster than was recommended and found herself drifting toward the wrong side of the channel. The other ship entering the harbor was the French freighter SS Mont Blanc. She had arrived later than expected and moved cautiously into the port, sitting low in the water beneath the weight of her cargo. Unbeknownst to most people in Halifax that morning, the Mont Blanc carried one of the largest and most volatile assortments of explosives transported during the war. Her holds were packed with picric acid, trinitrotoluene, gun cotton, and barrels of highly flammable benzol stored on deck. In effect, she was a floating bomb navigating one of the busiest harbors in the world. Around mid-morning, both ships attempted to maneuver through the Narrows at the same time. Confusing whistle signals, misjudged turns, and pressure to move quickly created a chain of small mistakes. The Imo pressed forward at an unsafe speed while the Mont Blanc tried to adjust her course to avoid a collision. Their evasive actions, however, only brought them closer. When the 2 vessels finally met, the impact itself was slow and seemingly minor. The Imo struck the starboard bow of the Mont Blanc at little more than a crawl. Under normal circumstances, it would have been nothing more than an inconvenience, but that seemingly harmless scrape toppled several deck barrels of benzol, spilling the liquid across the ship. As the metal hulls grated together, sparks were created, igniting the vapors almost instantly. Flames burst across the deck, racing upward and feeding on the chemical fumes. The collision had lasted only a moment, but the result was catastrophic. A fire now burned aboard a ship filled with thousands of tons of wartime explosives, and with that spark, the countdown toward one of the most powerful non-nuclear explosions in human history had begun. For roughly 20 minutes after the collision, the SS Mont Blanc drifted slowly toward the Halifax shoreline, fully engulfed in flames. Thick black smoke poured upward, forming a towering column that could be seen across the city. The crew, fully aware of the deadly cargo below deck, escaped in lifeboats as soon as the fire took hold. They shouted warnings in French as they rowed furiously toward the Dartmouth side, but very few people understood what they were trying to say. To the residents of Halifax, the burning ship looked dramatic, but not dangerous. Many believed it was simply another wartime accident. People stepped outside to watch from porches, street corners, and the waterfront. Others gathered on the railway tracks near Pier 6, an area with factories, homes, and working-class neighborhoods built close to the water. Firefighters rushed toward the drifting vessel, unaware of the unimaginable threat simmering inside it. At precisely 9:04 and 35 seconds in the morning, the fire reached the Mont Blanc's explosive cargo. In that instant, the ship vanished in a blinding flash of white light. The explosion released a force equivalent to several thousand tons of trinitrotoluene, making it the largest human-made blast ever recorded up to that point in history. Temperatures near the epicenter soared to several thousand degrees, vaporizing the surrounding water and obliterating the vessel entirely. A shockwave burst outward faster than the speed of sound, flattening structures across the northern part of Halifax. Entire blocks of the Richmond district were crushed in seconds as homes, warehouses, and industrial buildings collapsed. Snapped telegraph poles and twisted railway tracks showed the incredible strength of the pressure wave, which tossed debris like paper and hurled heavy objects great distances. The flash of light shattered windows across the city, driving shards of glass into anyone who had stopped to watch from indoors. Thousands suffered facial and eye injuries. a tragic result of the momentary curiosity that led so many to look out their windows at the burning ship. The sound of the blast carried far across the region, reaching communities well beyond the harbor. The explosion also displaced an enormous volume of seawater. For a brief moment, the harbor floor was exposed. Then the water surged back with violent force, forming a powerful tsunami that crashed against both shores. The wave rose high above the normal tide line, smashing buildings weakened by the blast and sweeping debris and victims into the harbor. On the opposite side of the water, an indigenous Mi'kmaq community that had lived along the shoreline for generations was destroyed, its homes carried away by the churning surge. In less than a single minute, Halifax had been transformed. A fire had become an explosion, and the explosion had unleashed a tidal wave. What remained was a shattered port city, struggling to comprehend the scale of what had just occurred. When the thunder of the blast faded, Halifax was left in an eerie, dust-filled silence. Entire neighborhoods near the waterfront had been reduced to splintered wood, broken bricks, and tangled metal. Those who survived the shockwave emerged into streets that no longer resembled the city they had known only moments before. Fires burned unchecked throughout the ruins, fed by collapsed homes, burst fuel lines, and overturned stoves. Smoke hung heavy over the harbor as survivors stumbled through debris, calling out for missing family members. Across the city, thousands were injured, many were dazed, wandering with cuts, burns, and shattered limbs, trying to find help in a landscape where many doctors' offices and medical buildings had been destroyed. Schools, churches, and private homes that remained standing were quickly transformed into makeshift aid stations. Tables became operating surfaces, and blankets were used as bandages, while the injured poured in faster than anyone could treat them. One of the earliest acts of heroism came from a railway dispatcher named Vince Coleman, who had stayed at his telegraph post, even after learning that an explosives-laden ship was burning nearby. Before the blast reached him, he tapped out a final urgent message, warning an incoming passenger train to stop. His quick thinking saved hundreds of lives, though he did not survive the explosion himself. His final transmission would later become one of the defining moments of courage in the disaster. In the devastated Richmond district, soldiers and civilians clawed through collapsed houses with their hands, searching desperately for voices under the rubble. Railway workers used whatever equipment remained functional to pull wreckage aside. Many people trapped in the ruins called out for help, but the scale of destruction made it impossible to reach everyone quickly enough. The mixture of broken water mains and smoldering fires created dangerous conditions for rescuers, who often had to work cautiously to avoid further collapses. Communication lines throughout the city were crippled, leaving Halifax isolated in the crucial first hours. It took time for word of the catastrophe to reach surrounding towns, but once the enormity of the situation was understood, aid began to mobilize. Military bases in the region were among the first to respond, dispatching troops to help with rescue, fire suppression, and crowd control. Their arrival brought a brief sense of order to areas where chaos had taken hold. As daylight faded, the city grew even more perilous. The cold December temperatures began to settle in, and thousands of residents, injured, displaced, or unable to find shelter, faced a long, freezing night. With many homes destroyed and fires still burning, survivors gathered wherever walls still stood, huddling together for warmth. Volunteers distributed whatever blankets, candles, and supplies they could find, but the needs of the population were far greater than what the city alone could provide. Despite the devastation, small moments of determination emerged throughout the night. Families reunited against the odds. Soldiers carried injured children through the debris. Neighbors shared food, water, and clothing with those who had lost everything. Though Halifax was broken, its people refused to be defeated in the first dark hours after the catastrophe. In the hours following the Halifax explosion, the city faced a dual crisis. Rescue and recovery were complicated by the arrival of a massive winter storm the very next day. Snow fell heavily, accumulating over 16 inches in some districts, covering the shattered streets and ruins of the waterfront. The storm slowed search efforts, made transportation nearly impossible, and exposed survivors to dangerously low temperatures. Hypothermia became a real threat, and many who had survived the initial blast succumbed to the cold before they could be reached. Despite these harsh conditions, relief began arriving from across Canada and the United States. The first significant aid came from Boston, Massachusetts, which dispatched a special relief train carrying doctors, nurses, blankets, food, and medical supplies. The train traveled overnight, arriving into a city buried under snow and debris, relief workers immediately set up triage stations in whatever buildings remained standing, including schools, warehouses, and makeshift tents. Their work provided critical care to thousands, performing surgeries and stabilizing severe injuries that local resources could not handle alone. Other communities in Nova Scotia and beyond followed quickly. Volunteers and military personnel assisted in clearing debris, reinforcing structures at risk of collapse, and distributing food to the homeless. Temporary shelters were established in churches, factories, and halls, accommodating tens of thousands of displaced residents. In total, over 25,000 people were left without adequate shelter, many of whom spent the first nights in extreme cold while awaiting help. Amid the chaos, extraordinary acts of heroism were recorded. Civilians, soldiers, and emergency workers risked their lives to rescue people trapped under rubble, carrying children and the injured to safety. Hospitals operated around the clock with makeshift operating rooms set up in classrooms and offices. The unprecedented number of eye injuries and burns presented unique challenges, prompting medical teams to develop rapid triage methods for treating large-scale trauma. The disaster forged enduring bonds between Halifax and its supporters. In recognition of Boston's rapid and effective response, the city of Halifax sent a Christmas tree to Boston the following year as a gesture of gratitude. That tradition continued and evolved, eventually becoming an annual event that lasts to this day. The aid not only saved lives, but also established a model for coordinated international disaster response in North America. By the end of the first week, the combination of relief efforts and the bravery of ordinary citizens began to stabilize the city. Though thousands remained homeless and the devastation was immense, the quick arrival of help prevented even greater loss of life. The lessons learned in those critical hours influenced future emergency planning, hospital preparedness, and the handling of dangerous cargo in harbors across the world. In the months and years following the Halifax explosion, the city faced the monumental task of rebuilding. Entire neighborhoods had been obliterated, leaving tens of thousands without homes. Urban planners and engineers seized the opportunity to redesign the waterfront, creating wider streets, fire breaks, and more organized layouts to prevent similar catastrophes. One of the most notable projects was the Hydrostone District, constructed with reinforced concrete and designed to provide safer, more fire-resistant housing for working-class families. This area became a model for modern public housing in Canada and remains a historic district today. The medical community also saw lasting effects. The sheer number of injuries, particularly eye trauma, prompted advances in ophthalmology. Hospitals refined emergency triage protocols, and the experience led to improvements in trauma care, pediatric treatment, and disaster medicine. The Canadian National Institute for the Blind, founded in response to the explosion's devastation, provided support and resources for victims who lost their sight, shaping disability services for decades. Socially, the explosion fostered remarkable solidarity. Volunteers and citizens who survived the disaster contributed to relief efforts, creating an enduring spirit of community resilience. The bond between Halifax and Boston, established during the initial relief, became an annual tradition with a Christmas tree exchange, symbolizing gratitude and ongoing friendship born from tragedy. Over time, memorials were erected, and the event became a key part of Halifax's historical narrative, educating future generations about the consequences of industrial hazards and human error. Economically, Halifax faced significant challenges. The port, a vital hub for trade and wartime supplies, required extensive reconstruction. Shipping resumed gradually, but the waterfront's devastation highlighted the importance of improved safety regulations for the transport of explosives. Maritime laws were revised, introducing stricter protocols for harbor traffic, labeling of dangerous cargo, and emergency preparedness. These measures reduced the risk of similar catastrophes in Canadian ports and influenced international maritime safety standards. Despite the unimaginable destruction, Halifax emerged stronger and more resilient. The disaster demonstrated both the destructive power of human error combined with volatile materials and the extraordinary capacity for recovery, ingenuity, and compassion. Over 100 years later, the Halifax explosion stands as a stark reminder of how quickly life can change, and how communities can rebuild, adapt, and honor the memory of those lost in moments of unimaginable catastrophe. In December of 1811, the heart of the American frontier lay quiet under a crisp winter sky, completely unaware of the catastrophic events about to unfold. The epicenter of what would become the New Madrid earthquake sequence was near the small river town of New Madrid in what was then the Louisiana Territory. This settlement was home to roughly 400 people, pioneers, riverboatmen, and Native American tribes living along the Mississippi River in a world defined by dense forests and wide open plains. For them, earthquakes were something distant, events that occurred in mountains far away, not the flat, seemingly stable lands of the central United States. Their log cabins and wooden homes were designed to withstand storms, not a ground that would soon roll and tear like liquid beneath their feet. On the night of December 15, 1811, residents described the air as unusually thick, almost oppressive. Families went to sleep as they normally would, unaware that within hours, their world would be violently shaken. The Mississippi River, usually a calm and reliable force, flowed quietly past their homes, hiding the immense power that was gathering beneath the earth. There were no warnings, no seismic instruments, and no prior experiences in this region to hint at the destruction about to strike. Then, in the early hours of December 16th, the first great shock hit. The epicenter lay in present-day northeast Arkansas, but the shaking radiated for hundreds of miles, affecting areas far beyond New Madrid. People described the ground moving in waves, snapping mature trees, and throwing sand and water from fissures that opened across the landscape. Even distant observers reported hearing loud thunder-like noises that seemed to roll across the land. For the inhabitants of the Mississippi Valley, this was an incomprehensible and terrifying event. The earth itself had come alive, and the frontier would never feel the same again. At approximately 2:15 in the morning on December 16, 1811, the first massive earthquake struck the New Madrid area. Modern estimates place its magnitude between 7.2 and 8.2, making it one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded in the central United States. Residents described a violent shaking that threw them from their beds, while trees snapped and buildings creaked under the force. Eliza Bryan, a woman living in New Madrid at the time, recalled hearing a deep, vibrating roar, resembling thunder, but far more intense and persistent. Outside, the landscape was in chaos. The ground heaved in visible waves, rising and falling by several feet, and geysers of sand and water erupted from fissures that had opened across the Mississippi River floodplain. Log cabins and chimneys were toppled, and entire groves of trees were uprooted. People screamed in panic, many believing an attack was underway, while livestock fled in terror. The Mississippi River itself appeared to boil and churn, reflecting the upheaval beneath the surface. Just hours later, as dawn broke on the 16th, a powerful aftershock, estimated at magnitude 7.0, struck the same region. The second shock caused further damage to the already weakened structures and intensified the psychological strain on the survivors. Buildings that had survived the first quake now collapsed, and soil liquefaction swallowed parts of farmland, leaving the land unstable and treacherous. The small settlement of Little Prairie, now Caruthersville, Missouri, was almost completely destroyed, forcing residents to flee. In the days that followed, thousands of smaller tremors rattled the region, keeping the population on edge. People avoided indoor spaces, fearing their homes could collapse at any moment. Trees continued to topple, and new cracks opened across the terrain. The Mississippi River's banks shifted, and sand blows, large deposits of water and sand forced from below, scattered across fields, destroying crops and altering the local landscape. The frontier community had entered a state of ongoing terror, unsure when the earth would strike again or if it ever would stop. After the terrifying shocks of December 16, 1811, the region remained on edge. Residents of the Mississippi Valley had barely begun to assess the destruction when the earth struck again. On January 23, 1812, a second major earthquake shook the Missouri boot heel. This tremor, estimated at magnitude 7.0 to 7.8, caused fresh fissures to open in the ground, warped the riverbanks, and triggered landslides along the Mississippi. Though smaller than the first quake, it reignited fear across the sparsely populated settlements. Log cabins that had survived the initial shocks were now badly damaged or destroyed, and new sand blows emerged, further altering farmland and low-lying areas. Then, on February 7, 1812, at approximately 3:45 in the morning, the third and most powerful quake struck. With modern magnitude estimates ranging from 8.7 to 8.8, it obliterated what remained of New Madrid and surrounding areas. The shaking was so intense that it caused the Mississippi River to temporarily flow backward, forming temporary waterfalls and rapids. Ground uplift and subsidence permanently reshaped the landscape, creating the 15,000-acre Reelfoot Lake in what is now Tennessee. Entire forests were submerged, and islands that had stood for decades vanished beneath the water. The destruction was compounded by ongoing aftershocks, which continued for months. Settlers reported that the land heaved beneath their feet even when the major quakes had passed, and thousands of smaller tremors kept the population in fear. For those who had survived the first shocks, the February quake was a terrifying confirmation that the disaster was not over, and that the Earth itself had become an unpredictable and dangerous force. Communities were displaced, crops destroyed, and the frontier wilderness now included vast areas of flooded, unstable land. By the end of the series, the New Madrid area had been permanently transformed. While the human death toll remained relatively low due to the region's sparse population, the psychological and environmental impact was profound. Families abandoned towns, farms were ruined, and the Mississippi River, a vital transportation route, was left unpredictable and altered for decades. The earthquakes had proven that even the heart of the continent was vulnerable to immense geological forces, setting a precedent for understanding seismic risk far from tectonic plate boundaries. So why did these earthquakes strike so violently in the middle of the continent? Unlike the West Coast, which sits along the San Andreas and other active plate boundaries, the New Madrid region is far from any major tectonic edge. The answer lies deep beneath the surface in an ancient geological feature known as the Reelfoot Rift. Around 750 million years ago, this part of North America attempted to split apart, forming a continental rift. The attempt failed, leaving behind a buried network of weakened faults, including the New Madrid seismic zone. Over time, tectonic pressure accumulated along these faults, and in 1811, it finally released catastrophically. The region's geology magnified the shaking. The Mississippi Valley is composed of soft, alluvial soils deposited by the river over thousands of years. Unlike bedrock, this loose sediment transmits seismic waves more efficiently, allowing the quakes to be felt across huge distances. In fact, the shaking was recorded over 1 million square miles, reaching as far north as Canada and as far east as the Atlantic coast. Chimneys toppled in Kentucky, homes shook in Ohio, and church bells rang in Boston. The quakes demonstrated that earthquake damage is not solely determined by magnitude, but also by the type of ground beneath communities. The New Madrid sequence also permanently altered the landscape. Sand blows, volcano-like eruptions of water and sand from below, covered vast tracts of farmland, while massive sections of the Mississippi riverbank collapsed. Reelfoot Lake was created when the land sank and the river flooded the depression. Smaller waterways shifted course, and some low-lying forests were permanently submerged. The quakes even caused small river islands to disappear, forever changing the region's geography. Beyond the physical changes, the events offered scientists the first clear insight into intraplate earthquakes, those occurring far from plate boundaries. Observations of soil liquefaction, fissures, and river reversal provided invaluable data for future studies. Today, researchers continue to monitor the New Madrid seismic zone, which averages around 200 small quakes annually, most too minor to be felt. Historical analysis of the 1811 to 1812 sequence informs modern earthquake preparedness, hazard mapping, and building codes for areas that were previously thought safe from major seismic activity. For those living along the Mississippi today, the lessons of the New Madrid earthquakes remain crucial. The dense population, critical infrastructure, and economic significance of cities like Memphis and St. Louis mean that a repeat of the 1811 events could cause far greater human and financial loss than the sparsely populated frontier ever did. Understanding the science behind these quakes is not just historical, it is essential for modern disaster preparedness and risk mitigation. The New Madrid earthquakes left more than just physical scars. They left a profound imprint on the way Americans understood natural disasters. For decades, the region's sparse population and frontier conditions meant that many survivors' stories became folklore rather than formal records. Yet the landscape itself preserves evidence of the quakes even 2 centuries later. Reelfoot Lake, the sunken lands in northeast Arkansas, and countless sand blows across Missouri and Tennessee stand as enduring reminders of nature's power. Geologists continue to study these features, to better understand intraplate seismicity and the risks posed by dormant fault zones. Modern scientists consider the New Madrid seismic zone one of the most hazardous regions in the eastern United States. The area has the potential to produce magnitude 6 to 7 earthquakes, and even moderate vents could cause significant damage to today's dense population centers. Cities like Memphis, St. Louis, and Cape Girardeau sit atop the same ancient rift system that unleashed the quakes of 1811 and 1812. Infrastructure built without consideration for such seismic activity would be highly vulnerable, and emergency management plans now take the historical precedent into account when preparing for potential disasters. The historical quakes also fundamentally changed American science and engineering. The unusually wide area of strong shaking challenged early notions of earthquake behavior, showing that destruction could extend far from the epicenter. Observations of liquefaction, river reversals, and landscape deformation informed future hazard mapping and helped scientists recognize that earthquakes could occur far from plate boundaries. These lessons would later influence seismic building codes and disaster preparedness strategies nationwide. For the people of the Mississippi Valley, the psychological legacy was also lasting. Oral histories recount the terror, the constant tremors, and the fear of returning to homes that seemed unstable. Generations grew up aware that the ground beneath them was not as solid as it seemed. This awareness contributed to a cautious culture when settling or building in the affected areas, a form of early risk mitigation long before formal earthquake planning existed. Ultimately, the New Madrid earthquakes are a stark reminder that even the most stable seeming land can harbor hidden dangers. They demonstrate how natural forces can reshape the environment, disrupt lives, and challenge human understanding. 200 years later, the quakes serve as both a historical event and a modern warning. The forces beneath our feet are powerful, unpredictable, and demand respect. Preparing for the unseen threats of today depends on remembering the lessons of 1811 and 1812. Lessons written not only in documents but in the very landscape of the American heartland. In 1930, the Meuse Valley in Belgium was a narrow corridor of industrial power. Stretching along the Meuse River near Liège, the valley was home to a staggering concentration of factories, each contributing to Belgium's rapid economic growth. There were iron mills belching smoke, smelters glowing red with molten metal, coke ovens, glassworks, and chemical plants producing everything from fertilizer to explosives. In total, 27 major factories operated day and night, creating a dense layer of industrial emissions that hovered over the valley. For the people living there, smokestacks were a familiar sight, symbols of employment and prosperity, but the valley had a long history of air pollution complaints. As early as the 19th century, locals had raised concerns about the noxious fumes that blanketed their homes and fields. In 1911, a similar fog had settled in a nearby valley, killing livestock and serving as a warning of what stagnant air mixed with industrial emissions could do. Yet despite these warnings, authorities largely overlooked the risk in the pursuit of industrial productivity. By the winter of 1930, the stage was set for disaster. The valley's geography, a narrow, low-lying area bordered by hills, trapped air and pollutants, with minimal wind and a high concentration of toxic gases being released daily. The conditions were increasingly hazardous. Residents went about their routines, unaware that the combination of industry, geography, and weather was creating a toxic environment. The air they breathed each day was already laced with dangerous chemicals, but no one could predict that a perfect storm of weather and pollution was about to turn the valley into a death trap. This industrial landscape was not only a hub of human activity, but also a ticking time bomb. Every smokestack contributed to a growing cloud of sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and other harmful chemicals. People and animals alike were exposed daily, with subtle health effects going largely unnoticed. For decades, the Meuse Valley had been a center of progress and innovation, but in December 1930, it would become the epicenter of one of the first scientifically documented air pollution disasters in modern history. The disaster began on December 1st, 1930, when a cold, damp fog settled over the Meuse Valley. Thick and motionless, it might have seemed ordinary at first, but this fog coincided with a rare weather phenomenon known as a thermal inversion. Normally, warm air rises and carries pollutants away, but during an inversion, a layer of warmer air traps colder air near the ground. With little to no wind, the valley's air became stagnant, effectively sealing in all the emissions from the factories below. By December 2nd, the fog had grown heavier and more acrid. Smoke and chemical fumes from the 27 factories, including sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and other industrial pollutants, were trapped under the inversion. Residents began to notice irritation in their throats, persistent coughing, and a burning sensation in their lungs. Animals in the area became distressed, livestock struggled to breathe, and many farmers moved them to higher ground in hopes of avoiding the toxic air. By December 3rd, the fog had become a lethal chemical soup. People were collapsing in their homes, struggling for every breath. Hospitals were overwhelmed, with physicians unable to provide adequate care to the growing number of patients suffering from respiratory distress. Panic spread quickly. Newspapers described the fog with names like the Black Death, and the region was referred to as the Valley of Death in reports that tried to capture the horror of the moment. The peak of the crisis occurred between December 3rd and 5th. Within this short period, 63 people had died, the majority of them in Meuse, the valley's most industrialized town. Victims were primarily the elderly or those with pre-existing heart and lung conditions, but the deadly fog did not discriminate entirely. The youngest known victim was a 20-year-old woman named Louise Damps, who collapsed and died while walking home from a social gathering. Beyond the fatalities, an estimated 6,000 people suffered serious respiratory problems. The Meuse Valley, a symbol of industrial progress, had become a corridor of sudden and devastating human suffering. After December 6th, when the fog finally lifted, experts began piecing together the cause of the Meuse Valley disaster. Authorities initially had no idea what had killed dozens of residents so quickly. Some newspapers speculated wildly about foreign gas attacks or new epidemics, while others assumed it was merely a freak weather event. The government quickly organized a scientific investigation, sending teams to perform autopsies and collect environmental samples. Autopsies revealed that victims showed no signs of systemic poisoning. Instead, their lungs were filled with fluid, a condition known as pulmonary edema, indicating they had essentially drowned in the air they were breathing. The airways were congested with mucus, and the damage was concentrated in the respiratory system rather than internal organs. This pointed investigators toward inhaled toxins rather than an ingested or bloodborne poison. Chemical analysis confirmed that the fog had become a lethal cocktail of industrial pollutants. Sulfur dioxide, a byproduct of coal combustion, common in the valley's iron and smelting plants, was the primary culprit. When mixed with water vapor in the dense fog, it formed sulfuric acid aerosol, which severely damaged lung tissue. Investigators also considered the role of fluorine gas, produced by at least 15 of the valley's factories. Danish scientist Kai Roholt, a leading expert on fluorine, argued that it may have contributed to the deaths, though this view remained contested. The investigation concluded that the perfect storm of circumstances, a thermal inversion, stagnant fog, and continuous emissions from factories, had transformed the valley's air into a corrosive and deadly substance. For the first time, scientists had documented an acute air pollution event that killed people almost instantly, providing crucial evidence that industrial emissions could have catastrophic health consequences when combined with specific weather conditions. This investigation laid the groundwork for later studies on industrial air pollution and public health regulations worldwide. The Meuse Valley disaster left a lasting mark on environmental science and public health, even though the factories themselves were never held legally responsible. The official explanation at the time labeled the tragedy as an act of God, attributing it to a rare combination of weather events and industrial emissions. Yet the scientific findings could not be ignored. For the first time, it was proven that acute air pollution from industrial activity could kill large numbers of people in a very short period. The event became a turning point for air quality research. Scientists emphasized the role of sulfur dioxide and other industrial pollutants in creating lethal conditions during thermal inversions. Public health authorities began to study the impacts of industrial emissions more seriously, recognizing that densely populated industrial regions were particularly vulnerable to similar incidents. This awareness slowly led to the creation of monitoring programs designed to prevent future disasters. The Meuse Valley disaster also served as a chilling warning for other industrialized cities. Less than 2 decades later, in 1948, a nearly identical event occurred in Donora, Pennsylvania, where 20 people died and thousands were sickened by a smog of industrial pollutants trapped by weather conditions. In 1952, London faced the Great Smog, which killed thousands and affected an entire metropolis. Scientists later traced these disasters back to lessons learned in 1930, noting that the combination of stagnant air, industrial emissions, and urban populations could be deadly. In Belgium, the town most affected by the disaster, a memorial plaque and statue were erected in 2000 to commemorate the victims, ensuring that the event would not be forgotten. The lessons of the Meuse Valley helped shape modern air pollution regulations, demonstrating the importance of industrial oversight and environmental monitoring. The disaster showed that the pursuit of industrial progress without attention to safety could have lethal consequences, and that science and public policy must work hand in hand to protect human life. Ultimately, the Meuse Valley disaster became the first documented example of how industrial pollution could rapidly escalate into a public health crisis. It reminded the world that the air we breathe is not just a background element, it is a vital component of survival, and neglecting its safety can turn progress into tragedy. By the time the fog finally lifted on December 6, 1930, the immediate crisis in the Meuse Valley had passed, but its implications were far from over. 63 people had lost their lives, thousands more had suffered serious respiratory illness, and entire communities were left shaken by the invisible threat that had swept through the industrial towns. The disaster highlighted the deadly intersection of human activity and natural conditions, proving that even modern, bustling industrial regions were vulnerable to unforeseen environmental hazards. In the aftermath, the tragedy prompted governments, scientists, and public health officials to rethink how industrial emissions were managed. And although the factories were never legally punished, the evidence gathered during the investigation laid the groundwork for modern air quality monitoring and environmental regulation. The event demonstrated the importance of considering the cumulative effects of industrial pollutants, particularly in areas where weather patterns could trap toxic air close to the ground. The Meuse Valley disaster also shaped public awareness. People began to recognize that clean air was not merely a luxury, but a necessity for life. Schools, hospitals, and municipal authorities started taking precautions during severe weather events, and scientific research into air pollution accelerated. The incident became a cautionary tale, showing that neglecting environmental health could have catastrophic consequences, and that proactive measures were essential to prevent similar events. Subsequent pollution disasters, including the smog in Donora, Pennsylvania in 1948 and the Great Smog of London in 1952, echoed the Meuse Valley tragedy. These events reinforced the understanding that industrialized societies needed to balance economic progress with public safety, and that legislation and monitoring were vital to protect communities from preventable hazards. Today, the Meuse Valley disaster remains a historical reminder of the fragile relationship between human industry and natural forces. It stands as both a warning and a lesson. Even a relatively small valley, packed with factories and subject to unusual weather, can become a deadly trap. The 63 lives lost and the thousands affected continue to remind us of the human cost of ignoring environmental risks. Through memorials in Meuse and ongoing scientific study, the Meuse Valley disaster endures as a pivotal moment in the history of industrial safety, public health, and environmental awareness.